Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. I think we will
All right.
begin very quickly. Rena, if you may share the presentation, it will be super nice.
So we have just admitted all the participants, and Rowena here will share the presentation. Nakamute ba ako?
And maybe
Okay.
we are still waiting 1 extra minute, or some participants are still joining before you launch it, Jerome.
Yeah, we'll wait until 3 minutes past the hour.
But once again, thank you all for joining. Feel free to present you in the chat, and also to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen during the presentation, etc., if you have any question you want to ask.
Okay, Celine, we should get started. Good day, good morning, and good afternoon, colleagues. I hope everyone is doing great. But before we start, I'd like to confirm that you can hear me. So if you can, please hit the thumbs up button so we know if the connection is clear and you can hear us clearly. All right. Thank you for the confirmation. Next slide, Ms. Wang. Before we start, I'll introduce myself first. I'm Jerome Balinton. I'm CALP's Deputy Regional Representative for Asia Pacific, and I'm sitting in on behalf of my colleague Michael, CALP's Regional Representative for the region. During this webinar, my colleague Celine Sinitsky-Billard, who is also on the video, will co-facilitate with me, and we have our colleague Rowena, who is working behind the scene. Our colleague Ruth McCormack, who is based in Canada, has facilitated this same webinar in the America-friendly time, July 18th last week. So welcome to the third webinar of the year of our Community of Practice for CVA, Climate and Environment. This webinar will explore the relationships between climate change, CVA, social protection, and humanitarian response. It will cover the fundamentals in understanding the functions of social protection in the context of socio-economic impacts of the climate crisis, linkages to humanitarian programming, and a range of potential uses of CVA. This is the Asia-friendly webinar, and as mentioned, we have held the America-friendly webinar last week. Before the webinar proper, we'd like to give a few reminders. This webinar is scheduled for 90 minutes. We will try our best to finish on time. It is also being recorded, and give us a few days to prepare the recordings and the materials, which we will upload on the CALP website for you to access freely. And since we are in a webinar mode, your microphone are on mute by default, but please do use the chat box to introduce yourselves. Translation at the moment is not available. My colleague Celine will put the presentation in French and Spanish in the chat. To keep the interaction while the webinar is ongoing, next slide, please. We encourage you to use the Q&A box to ask your questions. And if you also agree to those questions that were put in the chat box, you can also add by putting in the thumbs up. We will monitor that box to answer the questions. And again, we encourage you to introduce yourselves and use the chat box to share your reactions to the presentation and to engage with fellow participants. As for our agenda, today's meeting, so we have right after the welcome and introduction to the topic, we will hear presentation about social protection and climate change, the impacts and functions and linkages to humanitarian CVA, and to be followed by presentation on social protection, climate adaptation, and CVA. And the last part of our meeting for today is a panel discussion to be joined by several of our friends from different agencies and countries. And we are glad to present to you our presenters and panelists for today's webinar. And this is just an overview because we will present them individually later. We have Shanti Singupta, Matthew Walsham as our presenters. And we have Inga Stokel, Johnny Sainzaya, and Yana Bischler as our panelists for later session. To continue and set the tone, I'll hand you over to Celine to give an introduction on the key findings of the latest State of the World's Cash Report. Over to you, Celine.
Thank you so much, Jérôme, for the quick introduction. So I'm pretty sure that you heard about State of the World Cash, or I hope so. If not, please see the report that I share the link in the chat. And in particular, we will go on the State of the World Cash climate chapter, which is chapter 1. That we will discuss a bit more in the detail. So the topic for this webinar we have done so far this year, I've drawn from the chapter on the climate and environmental crisis, presented a framework to examine the various ways in which CVA is or could be used throughout the disaster reduction and response cycle. To help set the scene, we will start with some findings from that report very quickly. So climate change requires strategy that not only aim to reduce the frequency and severity of associated shock and relieve humanitarian needs, but critically also enable people and community to better adapt to, manage, and recover from the impact of events when they occur. Social protection can provide a mechanism to address multiple vulnerability associated with climate change and environmental degradation. And for example, adaptive social protection aims to build the capacity of poor households to prepare for, cope with, and adapt to shock, avoiding failure, falling further into poverty. Research has shown that using existing social registry data in a response without taking steps to layer in climate vulnerability could aggravate exclusion error. Similarly, modifying targeting to integrate vulnerability to shock can increase effectiveness with the risk of increasing vulnerabilities if climate change isn't explicitly considered in the design and targeting of social assistance. So partner coordination across government and the humanitarian sector are key to facilitate it effectively. Next slide, please. So the potential for leveraging social protection system to institutionalize anticipatory action is well documented. Also, so far has not been operationalized at scale. Evidence indicates that one-off anticipatory transfer cannot fully facilitate a quick recovery with further transfer required. The interplay between these systems and processes, as we see in the diagram. Oh, sorry, next slide. I was not, yeah. Next slide again. We see in the diagram, no, sorry, previous one, appear to be central for the planning and action. So we see the different one. So adaptation and resilience building are inevitably longer term processes with a critical role for cash-based social protection. There is evidence that providing cash transfer to poor households over the longer term increase coping capacity against climate extremes. However, evidence of the impact of short-term assistance on resilience is quite limited for now, with some recipients indicating that such intervention cannot effectively prepare them for complex climate crises. Cash for work or public work can play a role in supporting risk reduction and adaptation to build environmental resilience. It could include a wide range of intervention, carbon sequestration activity, reforestation, building and maintaining flood defenses, for example. But they are typically fall with the scope of development and social protection of programming. Cash for work is pretty well established in humanitarian response too, and it's a potential to bridge longer term initiative and to link together. Social protection include cash assistance as a key tool that needs to be considered more strategically and to link better. Next slide, please. Great. So one of the key topics for future debate that was identified was if and how can CVA be designed to support and link to longer term holistic approach to addressing the climate crisis. To do so coherently and effectively require a drawn-up approach working beyond the usual boundary and in partnership of humanitarian response, including recognizing the central role of government and the relationship between CVA and pro-climate social protection. So today, the question that we want to explore as a central for this topic and for longer term processes is how might social protection use CVA to provide more effective and coherent support to population in managing, adapting to, and recovering from the impact of the climate and environmental crisis. Thank you, and back to you, Jérôme.
Thank you, Celine. And now to hear more about the role of social protection in climate change, we are joined today by Shanti Singupta. And to introduce Shanti, Shanti is an experienced social protection and climate change expert working as an independent consultant with several agencies, including the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, UNICEF, World Food Program, ILO, and the Climate Change and Social Protection Research Initiative. Over the last 7 years, Shanti has supported national governments and institutions in strengthening social protection systems to manage and address climate risks better. Currently based in Berlin and having roots from India, she holds 2 masters in analysis and design of social protection systems and water policy and governance. Her expertise includes designing and implementing social protection policies and programs, conducting feasibility studies, risks and vulnerability assessments, and stress tests for anticipatory social protection systems across Asian and African countries. Shanti, thank you for joining the webinar. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Jérôme, and thanks, Celine, for that overview. Good afternoon and good evening to all of you joining from the Asia-Pacific region. I don't need to introduce myself anymore after that. So, Jérôme, maybe please move on to the next slide, also the next one. Yes, thanks. So I'm covering a little bit on behalf of Anna McCord, who also was part of the last presentation we did in Latin America and Caribbean region. And so my presentation today will cover a little bit of making a common platform kind of when we talk about social protection, because I knew these questions came up on, like, we have the protection pillar in humanitarian and we are calling social protection in this in a very different way. So first we will just briefly touch upon social protection, then role of social protection for climate change. Then I'll speak a few examples on social protection and humanitarian linkages where this is happening in practice. Some of the advantages of integration that we have seen over the years with my experience in the Red Cross movement, and some of the emerging areas that we might want to discuss in the panel. So as Celine was mentioning, the State of the World's Cash Report recognizes one key message, and that is social protection should be adapted to enhance how they play a role in crisis response. But we who have been working in the social protection, we have been understanding that the social protection systems initially were designed to do a completely different task, and they have been traditionally addressing life cycle risks And if we want now some of these programs that are within social protection, which includes social assistance, for example, cash and in kind, or social insurance, which many of us even pay into contributory pay, pensions, health insurance, unemployment benefits. If we want these systems to be more effective for humanitarian response or crisis response, we cannot just stick to doing shock response or adapting or tweaking. We clearly saw, if you can press the next bits, we had the COVID-19 shock and we had the climate, several, excuse me, if you can press the next button for the, yes, thank you. Yes, so we have seen during COVID-19 and in several of the climate extremes in the past years that social protection, where it existed and where systems were mature, were much better prepared to address the crisis. So as we talk about making these systems more adaptive, and by adaptive, I mean both able to manage the short-term shocks as well as the long-term projected climate risks and the uncertainties that we are talking about, we kind of need to come together with the humanitarian sector and with all of the other sectors to make systems much more ready and existing properly and continuing the normal functioning in the first place, to make them further flexible, stronger, and adaptive. Next slide, please. And when we do this, there's an important role of incorporating climate information into the designing, into the planning for the programs. So we know that there has been quite a bit of analysis done and projections done, and some of these impacts that are projected by 2050 for the region that we are speaking about today, in Southeast Asia and South Asia and Pacific, for example, is the loss of arable land due to sea level rise and salinization. We know that there will be a decrease in crop yields from 2030 onward, and this can go up to 30% decline by 2080. Of course, decrease in crop yield and loss of arable land has a direct impact on the food security conditions in this region. And paddy or rice being one of the main crops, we will see a 50% decline of crop and paddy yield by 2050. So just to say, some of these countries in India and Pakistan and in Sri Lanka, there can be a projected increase of extreme poverty by 25%. And this poverty will be driven by food prices and recurring shocks, and including health shocks and out-of-pocket expenditures, because a lot of these people are not covered by formal social protection programs at this point. So going on to the next slide, we see that as a result of these kind of impacts, projected impacts, as well as the shocks that we are already facing, there will be some changes in how social protection system will need to address this. We will see that there are large-scale increases in the size of population who might not be able to meet the basic needs without external support, be it through humanitarian support or be it through regular social protection, who needs to increase coverage and the type of instruments that they're using to reach out to these new groups of people that they were not catering to earlier. We also will probably see a difference in the type of risk that we are facing and the type of risk that we are responding to. So going on from idiosyncratic shocks and idiosyncratic risks, we are moving into covariate risks as we have to extend coverage to new vulnerable populations, maybe migrants and displaced groups, transboundary migrants, and also those who might be affected by a transition to a lower carbon-based economy in these regions. So the other thing that I wanted to point out is that there will be a change, or there might be a change in the duration of how long a program or how long a social protection support is provided. So initially, we have often given one-time support, but with impacts lasting long and with compounding shocks happening, there might be a longer need for support from these groups. Adapting the spatial distribution of provision to accommodate some of these climate-induced needs will then need a rethinking of how social protection is viewed And in this space, we also want to see how much we can work together and where are the entry points to work better with the humanitarian sector. Next slide, please. So based on that background, we can kind of say that there are some functions of social protection which can be relevant for the humanitarian sector as well when we are talking about the climate change. Generally, social protection is addressed at reducing vulnerability to climate change, but it's also now seeing we are responding to climate shocks and disasters. So 1 and 2 is something that we see often, but we are also trying to see how social protection, and there are some evidence already, and Matthew will speak about some of these evidence later, where we see that social protection is being used for offsetting some of the negative welfare impacts of climate transition policies. It is in some places enabling climate change adaptation and also contributing to reducing the greenhouse gas emissions and improving carbon sequestration, as was shown, and that this is also part of the CALC report itself. And so it's clear that we are seeing some parlance that humanitarians and social protection actors, where they can be brought together and take up some of these functions. Next slide, please. So based on where your system are or your country's social protection system are, there might be opportunities to bring together and work with the humanitarian sector who are doing CVA, but now much more than that and using different instruments. As we understand, cash may not be the most appropriate instrument in all circumstances, but how the idea is to work from the left, where systems are not so mature, to right, where systems are complex, mature, has been existing for a long time and has a wide coverage, where we can use already existing systems to do vertical, horizontal expansions, or even create a new program and use already existing social registry to do targeting, for instance. And where it does not exist, there still might be opportunity to work together in terms of coordinating, understanding or fixing similar kinds of transfer levels, transfer amounts, targeting strategies. So there are some options where you can find an entry point in working with the social protection actors in your countries. Next slide, please. There are several advantages. Without going into the detail for all, we can talk about, for example, the capacity of when we bring together these two sectors working together. Of course, we are working with the capacities that the humanitarian sector have been developing for a long time. They are very well prepared and placed to scale up and reach a large number of people. But when doing through social protection programs who might have a bigger coverage, you can also reach out to larger caseloads. So in a way, it's bringing together these two capacities, well-established strengths of these two sectors, and reaching scale in a timely manner. It's also something that's more and more preferred by donors, as we see the donors prefer to give assistance when there is a connection with national systems and when there is quite a bit of focus on building national systems. So based on this, I will just take the last 5 minutes to speak a little bit on the examples where this social protection humanitarian sector have been coming together in practice. So in the next slide, please. In Nigeria, for example, funded by ECHO, we have worked on a 2-year project, which is now going on to the 3rd phase. But this was based on a flood-based trigger. So we were looking into historical forecast. We developed a trigger, and once the trigger is reached, we will provide anticipatory cash transfer to a selected target group in the community in the district of Kaduna in Nigeria. So this was implemented by UNICEF and Red Crescent Climate Center with support from Nigerian Red Cross. And what happened was we worked with the state social protection cash coordination units to also look into the social protection registry that they use, the social security register, to identify these groups who were also vulnerable from climate, but not just poverty vulnerable, which is the main parameter used in the register. Once we identify these people who might have climate vulnerability on top of being vulnerable to poverty, we created a waiting list that we then also obviously handed over to the state cash coordinating social protection agency so that they can also use this beneficiary list in the future to do similar kinds of targeting for flood vulnerability. And once the flood trigger was reached, we used the same financial service providers that are used for regular cash transfers to give anticipatory cash to up to 5,000 households. This was a 2-year project where we worked together with all these humanitarian partners, bringing together, working at subnational levels of social protection agencies. And the beneficiaries who were identified for this pilot are now part of the rapid response register, which will be used in the future for any form of shock response in the country. And also, since we prepared this rapid response register did not exist before, but now has become a subset of the main register, and they are enrolling new people into this registry. So this is also helping in building the system in the region. And now this is going on to the third phase where we are doing the same pilot in a different district. Next slide, please. So I'll actually skip this one and go on to the next slide because I would like to give an experience from the region. So for Nepal, what we have done also for floods, but over a period of 2 years, there was a lot of work with the national and the state social protection units to see how the biggest social security allowance, the biggest cash transfer program in the region, can be used to do an anticipatory action through social protection. And also based on a flood trigger, we have demonstrated using anticipatory cash, how cash can be distributed to the same target group of the usual cash transfer program. And we have also used the similar cash transfer bank accounts to deliver the anticipatory cash, which has not happened in the country before. And similar MOUs were drafted very quickly before the hazard to see how the same bank accounts which people use to receive their cash can be used to get money in advance. Now, this was an anticipatory action that was done, but not before the hazard happened, and after the hazard happened, but before the major impacts manifested in the community. So people could still use the cash. The other thing I wanted to mention that while this was done in anticipation, now the district officials and the national government officials through a cash and social protection working group have been trying to set up something like a public works program which can take anticipatory action in advance. For example, evacuation of livestock or early harvesting of seeds. So, and also they're trying to keep a portion of the disaster risk management fund to do this kind of anticipatory action through social protection. So while this was an anticipatory action driven by a humanitarian partner in the country, now the country counterparts have been trying to build programs and components in place to do this in the country through and driven by the national actors. With that, I just wanted to go on to the next slide and mention that there are these various areas that are emerging where we see coordination and dissemination work happening between humanitarian through different working group platforms. But we are also seeing more and more working together on targeting, on harmonizing on selection criteria to exclude the possibility of a lot of overlaps, targeting different regions, and coordinating on transfer values and how support is done in these regions. But in general, also supporting in monitoring and evaluation, delivery mechanisms, because these actors have been present in the countries for a long time, and it makes sense to work together with the social protection agencies in the country to build the capacity at the national level. So with that, I would like to stop and hand over back to Jerome and Celine.
Thank you, Shanti, for the presentation. Indeed, there are quite notable functions of social protection for climate change. And Just reflecting on that in our context here in the Asia Pacific, the unpredictability and you mentioned the recurring shocks really should compel us and the government to rethink and adapt social protection. Adapt is a key word that that echoes throughout your presentation. And finding the entry points on how to link CVA and social protection is a key ask, is a key requirement from different stakeholders. And thank you, Shanti, for the presentation. And now to present for our next presentation on social protection, climate adaptation, and CVA, we have Matthew Walsham. Matthew works for FAO Social Protection Team, focusing on the role of social protection in inclusive climate action. He has worked as a consultant on social protection for a range of organizations, including UNICEF, GIZ, and AFD, and was based for several years in Asia, particularly in Cambodia and Bangladesh, working on social protection and related topics, including a major evidence-gathering exercise on climate change and migration for International Organization for Migration in Bangladesh. Matthew has a PhD in development policy and planning from the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester and previously worked as a research fellow in social protection at the International Center for Evidence in Disability at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Matthew, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Right. Thank you very much for that introduction. And it's really good to be joining this session and also to be following Shayanti, who I think has set us up very well for the discussion that follows. Yeah, just to, focus in on that word adaptation or adaptive. I'm going to focus very much on adaptation in the sense of longer term adaptation to climate change beyond immediate shocks and see where we might think about some of the linkages between the kind of work that is more traditionally, under the humanitarian banner of CVA, but also under the term of shock responsive social protection and the links to longer term climate adaptation. Next slide, please. And yeah, I think it was really helpful that Shayanti set out some of the, the needs that we know we're facing long term and how these are going to impact on people's needs to access social protection, both on a range of dimensions. And Shayanti kind of covered 5 core functions that social protection can play in relation to this. I would just want to add one additional dimension where I think social protection has a really important role to play if we think about it from the climate perspective, which is about making climate action more inclusive. So we know that existing climate action being taken kind of globally is struggling really to reach the most vulnerable populations. So if we think about it from FAO's perspective, in our mandate with rural populations, only 1.7% of climate finance currently reaches small-scale farmers who are on the front line really of the impacts of climate change globally and certainly within the Asia-Pacific region as well. Actually the top quote here about delivering socially inclusive, gender responsive and nature positive climate and development action is actually from a joint statement of the multilateral development banks at the last COP. And social protection really has an important role to play in making climate action more resilient, contributing to this, but also making climate action more inclusive. Next slide, please. So I think Shayanti, touched on a range of the different functions that social protection is already playing. I just want to briefly, highlight this. We know social protection is doing a range of different things. So there's a couple of publications here that we've recently put out. One on a scoping review and the role of social protection in facilitating climate change adaptation and mitigation in rural areas. And I think these are going to be links to these reports are going to be posted in the chat. And another recent report, colleagues of mine looking at social protection and anticipatory action. So they're much more focused on the shock responsive component. We've also recently developed a course on managing climate risks through social protection that covers a range of these issues, and is also, it's available in English and in Spanish, English and French, and soon to be available in Spanish. So again, I think the link is being posted in the chat. But really what I want to highlight here is that we know social protection is playing this critical role in terms of absorbing climate shocks, and this will perhaps be the most familiar aspect to everybody on this call. But secondly, playing a really key role in relation to climate adaptation. So the scoping review that I've got here has good evidence from a range of programs around the world where social protection, including through for example, cash plus models, is doing more than just helping people absorb immediate shocks. It's also supporting them to develop and adapt to the longer term impacts of climate change. And a third dimension, which Shanti briefly mentioned, is contributing to climate mitigation. Not the focus of what we're going to discuss today, perhaps, but in relation to, say, public works programs, we're actually seeing some really interesting and large-scale impacts in terms of reduction of CO2 emissions. But a second element of how it contributes to climate mitigation goals is in terms of easing the socio-economic impacts of climate mitigation policies. So, for example, the withdrawal of fossil fuel subsidies that can impact very severely. They may be regressive overall, but they can still impact very severely on the most vulnerable population groups. And like I said, a thread running through all of this is the role that social protection has to play, including through all of these cash approaches, in ensuring that climate action is inclusive and reaches the poorest. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give a few brief examples. I don't have very long to speak. In contrast, I guess, to the example Shanti gave, they're going to be focused primarily on existing government programs, and we can discuss towards the end. I've got a couple of examples at the end where it's a different range of partners involved, and I think one of our discussions here is the interface, I guess, between these longer term government programs and humanitarian partners in the region. I'm starting with the Hunger Safety Net program, which is a very large scale unconditional cash transfer in Kenya. It can be scaled up in times of emergency, so before, during, and after shocks. And there's extremely good evidence suggesting that it helps to sustain consumption, it reduces the liquidation of assets, and that this is increasingly necessary in relation to the effect of climate shocks. So in common with the next program I'm going to present, one of the things to highlight here is that this wasn't designed initially as a climate program, but it is increasingly becoming a climate program. But all three that I'm going to present briefly here have maybe missing elements if we're thinking about the links between climate action, climate shock response, and climate adaptation. So in this case, the Hunger Safety Net program doesn't really have a kind of plus component. So we're talking about a really critical role in responding to shocks, really large scale, institutionalized, but perhaps not supporting that longer term adaptive change. Next slide, please. So the next one I want to highlight is the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme in India. So a very big public works program. And here we can see that, as with the previous program, it's got a key role to play in the aftermath of shocks, and that's increasingly the case. But its original design was actually much more focusing on the sort of normal agricultural lean season. So again, not designed initially as a climate program, but over time becoming more important in that domain. We've got, again, excellent evidence about how it sustains consumption, protects savings, improves health and education outcomes. And here we also have this evidence I was talking about the way in which it is contributing to natural resource management and to climate mitigation goals for India. A similar example would be the Productive Safety Net program in Ethiopia, where we again have excellent evidence on both dimensions. When I said kind of missing elements, I guess the contribution this program makes is very much to the development and maintenance of public assets, but there isn't really this element that focuses on household adaptation. So, I mean, there's the support through the cash component, but in terms of strengthening the livelihoods for individual households enrolled in the program, this one is much more focused on public assets. Next slide, please. So the third program I want to present is a little bit different. This is the PROESA project in Paraguay, and this is funded actually by the Green Climate Fund. So one of the UNFCCC climate funds, and for this particular project, FAO is the executing entity. And here it's a bit different in the sense that it builds upon an existing conditional cash transfer, so socially conditioned with health and education conditions government program called Tekapura. But then it's being combined with some new elements that are explicitly designed to reach and support climate goals. So alongside the socially conditioned cash transfer, there's now an environmentally conditioned cash transfer that is paid out based on whether or not the outcomes of sustainable forest management practices. So essentially, if deforestation is kept under control, kept in check, then households receive an environmentally conditioned cash transfer alongside the socially conditioned cash transfer. And at the same time, in order to support households to do this, it's a cash plus model as well. So alongside the cash transfers, households are being given support in terms of training on sustainable agroforestry. They're being given inputs in order to put this in place in practice. And the idea is they're being supported to transition from one particular agricultural or agroforestry model to a more sustainable model, and being incentivized to do this through cash payments and this additional cash plus support. So I said sort of missing elements. I mean, as you can tell, this one is actually designed with climate goals specifically in mind, an emphasis on really innovative uses of cash. It doesn't yet have a kind of shock responsive element built in. The primary climate agenda within this community is around increasing level of drought. So it's addressing that, but doesn't have the kind of shock responsive element explicitly built in. But we can see if we look at those three programs, different uses of cash and different ways in which programs can be used to address these broader climate goals. And we're talking here about a program that's linked to UNFCCC, and I want to, next slide, please, sort of now say a few broader things about the kind of wider climate agenda. So, because I think this is really important if we're thinking in the medium to long term, about how we link these different agendas in terms of CVA and the humanitarian agenda, shock responsive social protection, and then this broader agenda on adaptation and mitigation. Just to put the kind of context. So here we can see that increasingly at the global level, the role of social protection in relation to climate action is getting much better recognized. So at the last COP, the three major UNFCCC strategic work streams that are kind of of relevance to us, the Global Goal on Adaptation, the Just Transition work programs, helping communities and countries to transition into new green economic future, and the operationalization of a loss and damage fund so each of those, there's an explicit recognition of the role social protection has to play within this, and also in important related initiatives. So many of you may have heard of the V20 G7 Global Shield Against Climate Risks, which again, the role of social protection is increasingly well recognised as an instrument that governments are going to use through this programme under this agenda. Okay, next slide, please. And very briefly,
Matthew, you need to wrap up. I'm so sorry, you are already
okay, no problem.
Time. Thank you.
Sorry, I've gone slightly over time. Okay, I will wrap up very quickly. So very briefly, we looked at UNFCCC climate funds to see what was being done under existing programs, and we found under these three climate funds, GCF, GEF, and the Adaptation Fund, a really wide-ranging use of cash transfers and cash for work models alongside these kind of complementary services that I've talked about. Quite a focus on gender, but less of an ambitious agenda around the inclusion of vulnerable groups, which I was emphasizing at the start here. And then in terms of learning, the fact that cross-sectoral collaboration and system strengthening, this longer-term agenda, is absolutely critical to make this work in practice. Next slide, please. This is just to emphasize that we found these programs all over the world, so there's kind of global distribution. Next slide, please. Okay, two final slides. So ProASO I've already talked about in terms of this system strengthening agenda. I just want to give two quick examples and then I'll go on to my final slide. So alongside the Cash Plus ProASO approach, a public works program in Botswana, again, an existing government program, but here an agenda around how to use this to upskill people to work as ecosystem eco rangers and restoration workers. So an agenda where we're using public works with these longer term adaptation goals in mind and upskilling people. So a more ambitious agenda around what public works can achieve, not just about sort of short term shock response. And lastly, in Vanuatu, a shock responsive cash transfer program that is integrated as part of a broader program on climate resilience. But here, this is a program by Save the Children, and it's great that the shock responsive cash transfer element is in there. But there's also an adaptation element of this program, and what was perhaps missing is a link. So the two communities being sought by the shock responsive cash transfer and the adaptation component, they don't seem within the program at least to be linked. Now, next slide, please. This is my final slide. I want to just make one point though on this. So Save the Children have also just had a major project approved last week. So this is hot off the press in Mozambique, a $28 million Green Climate Fund program on building climate resilience and linking climate adaptation and social protection through decentralized planning. And there it's using government public works programs to promote the climate adaptation agenda. And really we can see that those linkages I was just talking about are built into that program. I think it's a really positive example of a link between the adaptation and the shock responsive agenda and these government systems with, in this case, Save the Children as the partner pushing this forward, that we can all learn from and hope to see more of going forward. So finally, considerations for the community. I think this, I really want to emphasize this medium long-term perspective that, Shayanti told us, that we need to be thinking about these kind of timescales, these kinds of needs, and also the role for the humanitarian, the CVA community, the shock responsive community, and social protection in thinking long term. Yeah. And in thinking long term, we need to think about government systems and strengthening these and incorporating this wide range of partners. And in doing that, we need to be thinking about government partners involved as well. So not only the social protection ministries, but disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management, and from outside of that, agricultural ministries, environment ministries, finance, how we link them together. Finally,
I'm so sorry, Matthew. I have to interrupt you.
Okay,
for
I'm going to stop there.
Everyone, Matthew will be there in tomorrow hangout if you want to continue discussion with him. You already have a lot of questions in the Q&A box, and thank you for the presentation, but we are really a bit over time. So I will put the link to the hangout and continue to ask your question to Matthew and Shayanti. They will answer in the Q&A box. Thank you. Back to you, Jerome.
Thank you, Matthew. Sorry for that. Thank you, Celine. So I really like the specific ways that Matthew shared on how social protection programs are used and examples of system strengthening. And I think during his session, during his presentation, he pointed out how important adaptation is for longer term programming and the roles of government, the different government agencies and its long-term programs, and of course, the role of humanitarian agencies in each country. Next slide, please. Thanks again, Matthew, for that. We'll now proceed to our panel discussion, and I have the pleasure to introduce to you our panel members. First one is Jana Bischler. She works at the ILO Social Protection Department in Geneva, where she focuses on social protection and climate change. In her position, Jana conducts research on the role of social protection in facilitating a just transition and addressing the impacts of climate change and support countries in the implementation of the ILO Just Transition Guidelines. On behalf of the ILO, she also co-chairs the USP 2030, or the Universal Social Protection 2030 Working Group on Social Protection and Climate Change. Prior to the ILO, Jana worked as a senior consultant in the social protection practice of Oxford Policy Management. She holds a Master of Science in Development Economics from the University of Oxford. Welcome, Jana. And our next panel member is Inge Sokol. She is a social protection advisor at the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, or DFAT, and independent social protection and international development consultant, with a focus on social protection and disaster and climate resilience. She has nearly 20 years experience in technical specialist roles and in leading development and humanitarian partnerships with the Australian government, the World Food Programme, the World Bank, and civil society organizations across the Asia Pacific, including in the Philippines, Cambodia, Indonesia, Myanmar, Mongolia, Papua New Guinea, and Tonga. Inge, welcome to the webinar. And our last panel member is Patbayar Sainsaya, or commonly known as Johnny. He is a dedicated professional with a robust background in climate change and humanitarian emergency affairs. Currently serving as a climate change and humanitarian emergency affairs specialist at the World Vision Mongolia, he has developed a comprehensive skill set and extensive experience in disaster risk reduction and climate change initiatives. Welcome to the webinar, Johnny, and I'll hand you over to Celine to facilitate our panel discussion. Over to you, Celine.
Thank you, Jerome, and thank you all for joining. I hope Matthew will have a bit more time during the panel discussion to continue what you were telling us. It was really super interesting. But first, I will maybe ask Jana and Inge a bit more about, according to you, setting the scene that we have from Scienti and the example for both Scienti and Matthew. What are the main forcing challenge arising from the climate crisis with regard to social protection, but also humanitarian response that you foresee? Can you give example and recommendation for plan and action to help on that? And of course, do you see that CVA might have a role in all that? Maybe Jana first and Inge to go next.
Sure. Thank you, Celine, and thanks everyone for inviting me, and thanks for the introductions, Jerome. So I think Scienti and Matthew have given a really good and comprehensive overview, of course. But maybe just to pick up sort of 2 points and comment a little bit on them. In terms of the main challenges, of course, the most obvious one is that climate change and the impacts of climate change are going to increase the needs of both social protection and humanitarian assistance, essentially by exacerbating the life cycle risks that people face, right? And this is quite important here to really go back to thinking about this framework of the life cycle risks, because it's going to help us understand how social protection can provide a systematic response to the challenges, right? So just thinking about it, for example, children face particular risks during childhood, but we also know that children are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Similarly, for older people, people with disabilities, and then, of course, some of the main ways in which climate change is going to impact, also on poverty is through its impact on health, but also on livelihoods and unemployment, all of which are life cycle risks, right? So essentially, social protection systems are designed to tackle life cycle risks. They're exacerbated by climate change. So one of the big priorities is really that we make progress in establishing these fundamental social protection systems that target life cycle risks. And that's also why the international social security and labor standards, for example, recommend and really highlight this role of strengthening social protection floors as a way to prevent crises, enable recovery, and ultimately build resilience. And we speak a lot about shock responsive social protection, adaptive social protection, but just to pick up this point again that Scienti said, that what we've really learned during COVID is that those countries with strong, universal, comprehensive, adequate social protection systems where people are covered for all of these life cycle risks really were in the best position to then also respond to these crises, because you already have a wide range of people covered. These predictable benefits, they sort of serve you know, as a way of maintaining a basic standard of living, also during crisis. And then, of course, you can scale them up further as you need to. And, you know, just going back also again to this point of Matthew in terms of, that Matthew made a lot in terms of the longer term adaptation, you know, we need to think of social protection not just as enhancing these coping capacities and helping people deal with crises, but actually at also helping them build the foundations in order to adapt their livelihoods, right? Because this is should ultimately be the goal. And, you know, this can go via mechanisms such as, you know, helping build human capital, helping build the education of children, which ultimately, you know, will provide people with a better capacity to learn, to do things differently, to transform, you know, their way of living, which is very, very difficult to do, of course, if you're in a constant state of crisis, right? So I think this is really where I think the first challenge lies, and where we need to really do much more. Another challenge that I maybe wanted to bring up that we haven't spoken about so much yet is we speak a lot about the challenges that, you know, that people will face and the higher needs, but we also need to think about the challenges that social protection systems themselves will face because of climate change, and what we might need to do in order to make sure that they can actually also continue, you know, fulfilling the function that they should be fulfilling, during, you know, disasters, floods, you know, storms, and so on, which might actually impact their own systems. And some of the, you know, actions that countries are already taking is things like conducting risk assessments or scenario modeling to evaluate what impact different climate hazards might have on their, you know, functions and service delivery capacity, you know, developing contingency plans and standard operating procedures for service delivering during emergencies, which might include, you know, providing services in new locations, rapid enrollment, alternative payment approaches, or surge capacity. And also this point that Shayanti touched on a little bit, which is around this portability also of social protection benefits. So if we know that there will be increased both internal and international displacement, you know, we really need to see to what extent the systems are actually prepared to make sure that people can access their benefits also in other locations and can actually, you know, not lose their right to access their benefits when they are displaced. I mean, just maybe one point in terms of the role of CVA. Of course, you know, the case for social protection is very compelling, but we also know, and this has been mentioned many times, that universal social protection is not a reality in many countries. And incidentally, and, you know, tragically, of course, the countries that are most impacted by climate change are also the countries where the coverage is the lowest. So the ILO has its upcoming publication of the World Social Protection Report in September, which focuses also on the role of social protection for climate action and a just transition. And some of the estimates there show that among the 20 countries that are the most vulnerable to climate change, less than 10% are actually covered by a social protection benefit. And, you know, so it's quite clear that in these kind of contexts, there will, you know, CVA will continue to play a really vital and life-saving role as the impacts of climate change are becoming more severe. But also, as we've heard before, I just wanted to stress again that even in these contexts where the social protection coverage is low, it is really important to keep building up the capacity of the state also during crisis response, right? And I think humanitarian actors really have a huge role to play here, in the sense of, you know, ensuring that it's as much as possible public authorities and the state that is in, you know, the coordinating the sort of coordinating seat, which might mean, you know, aligning CVA eligibility criteria and transfer values to those of government social assistance schemes, or also leveraging where possible government social protection delivery systems or expanding existing programs. And then finally, just a point to make, crises, we should also always continue as an opportunity, right, to continue strengthening the systems and expanding the systems more longer term in order to reduce these vulnerabilities more sustainably, which is also where this sort of coordination between social protection and humanitarian actors can really play a huge role to ensure that we use the recovery phase to close coverage gaps that made people vulnerable to the crisis in the first place, right? And there's quite a few examples also from our work where, for example, in Mozambique, after the COVID-19 pandemic, we've been working together with partners from the IMF, but also with the agencies that were delivering and helping implementing the emergency response to COVID, to actually then take some of these caseloads that were receiving temporary support, but that were actually eligible for government social protection programs, to then work on financing mechanisms in order to expand the coverage in the longer term to those groups that were not previously covered and that were then receiving emergency assistance.
Thank you, Jana, for all those good points. Indeed, I will add on the social protection systems that are always challenged, and to let you know that we are so sorry not having a panelist from the government of Philippines that should join because of the response to the typhoon at the moment. So they were unable to join, but definitely also great to see all the entry points that you are suggesting to link better all the humanitarian assistance, including cash, to use the social protection system and continue to strengthen it. We have also some common question from the chat and the Q&A box that says also maybe the entry point might be the other way around, inviting you to cash working group, for example, or thing like that. I mean, now that they are more in place. So quite great to set the scene and begin the panel. Thank you again, Jana. Please, Inge, may you step in on the same broad question?
Yeah, thanks, Celine, and thanks for having me join the panel today as well. Yeah, first of all, I just wanted to say Australia is very interested in exchanging ideas and learning on linking social protection with the humanitarian assistance, disaster risk reduction, and climate change. So, and as we all navigate this very complex space. I also wanted to do a shout out. So the Australia commissioned some research last year, which resulted in a publication called Rethinking Climate Change and Social Protection, authored by Cecilia Costello and Anna McCord. And yeah, it's great to see that some of the findings were reflected in Sayanti's presentation today as well. And I can post a link in the chat as well for everyone to have a look at that. Yeah, so as Sayanti and Jana already outlined, I mean, climate change will see greater need for social protection support, not only greater, but also different kinds of social protection for different groups and different needs in different geographical areas. So complexity is only increasing. I think we've already touched on enough on the role that social protection can play. But yeah, it's important to say that it can play a significant role in addressing these long-term climate change risks, as well as immediate responses as part of addressing climate shocks. So Australia is doing the same. So Jana was talking about the importance of strengthening existing social protection systems because that can address the longer term and the immediate impacts. And that's exactly what Australia is doing. So we're strengthening the reach and quality of routine social protection programs, and with the focus on making them inclusive, gender responsive, shock responsive, and also climate resilient. We do this through regional, bilateral, and multilateral social protection partnerships. For example, through the Partnerships for Social Protection, Australia partners with governments in the Pacific and Timor-Leste to strengthen national social protection systems in line with government's own reform priorities. In Cambodia, Australia, through GIZ and other development partners, is supporting the government of Cambodia to strengthen its social protection system to respond to shocks and to also integrate those longer-term climate change challenges. And equally, we're looking at potentially a new social protection program in the Philippines. So But more broadly, I think there's some immediate steps that we all can take as social protection specialists, as NGOs in the humanitarian and development space, to further the climate change and social protection linkages. 4 quick points here. So I think we can increase our understanding of the immediate and medium-term climate impacts and their implications in terms of social protection needs. And of course, as Matthew also outlined, this should include an understanding about who will most likely be affected, including diverse women and girls, people with disabilities, the elderly, youths, indigenous populations, etc. The second point would be about enhancing policy integration. And again, this also been raised by others as well, but promoting the potential role that social protection can play, and promote that role with climate actors by making sure social protection programming is informed by climate analysis to make the social protection system more resilient, and by adapting our own institutions and policies for the delivery of social protection and humanitarian assistance in line with these climate change implications. The third point is about reviewing our existing and partners' existing and new social protection interventions, and invest in enhancing operational systems to ensure that they can support emerging climate needs, and that the most marginalized groups are reached as well. And the last point is about supporting strategic financing through the consolidation of humanitarian, climate and social protection financing, and promote social protection as a mechanism for the delivery of climate financing and humanitarian assistance. I'll keep it there because there's a very large agenda, but Ayana already addressed some of the role that CVA can play, particularly in covering the gaps while there's still a lot of work to be done on strengthening the routine social protection systems in each country. Thank you.
Thank you, Inge. Indeed, I think, Jenny, you want to react to what Inge just said. Please, Johnny, go ahead with your reaction.
Okay,
Yes,
I wanted to share some example that I had. Basically, during the COVID-19 pandemic, and UNICEF and Mongolian government collaborated together in order to increase the child money from 20,000 to 100,000 local currency by using the social protection mechanism. Afterward, citizens in Mongolia and governments recognized the impact of the CVA in social protection mechanism. Based on this result, our government decided to deliver increase the child money for every child in every month since then. Yeah. I think it's one of the greatest case of shock responsive social protection. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and I just briefly add, I think this is the right time to have this conversation too. I think we have all seen the impact of how COVID-19 has really seen great increases in the investment in social protection and using social protection mechanisms to assist households and individuals. And it's great to hear this example from Mongolia as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I really think, or at least from a more CVA humanitarian perspective, we really see also more entry point during the COVID-19, to try to link better, to try to work together, to try to bridge a gap between the two. So maybe my next question to you, Inge and Jenny, that what you see are implications for more the humanitarian response in adapting design, implementation, funding, and how to interconnect that better with social protection, especially with all the new risk due to climate change.
Yeah, these are all really massive questions, right? We can talk about for hours. But again, I'll try to keep it short. Yeah, as I touched on just before, I think it really requires the integration, and I think Matthew as well, the integration of climate change, humanitarian and social protection policies and approaches. So have a greater dialogue between the different sectors, and not only at the national level, but also local level and regional levels and international levels, really, globally. So I think Sayanti also mentioned this. I think partner governments and donors are already increasingly focusing on the role of social protection as a tool for government-led crisis response and for building resilience to multi-hazard shocks. And I think equally for development and humanitarian partners, we can all focus on supporting governments to build inclusive and shock responsive social protection system. We could also, align as part of the humanitarian response, align with existing government systems as much as possible for response actions. And again, finally, just also looking at those financing strategies to enable responses not only after crisis but also before crisis. So on. So we know it has the long-term benefit. Social protection can play can deal with long-term and immediate climate impacts and hazard events. I think really the establishment of those inclusive and adaptable social protection system is really key. And not only establishing effective or efficient operations, really, but also implementing social protection reforms that expand the reach of cash transfer programs. So just as an example, the Tongan government in their latest budget a couple of months ago has lowered the age of eligibility of their elderly benefit scheme. And this will significantly increase or expand the reach of its social protection system to about a third of all Tongan households. So while this is intended as a regular life cycle social protection program, it actually also means that the program in times of shock can reach a significantly larger group of the population through social protection top-ups. So, it's that adaptability that it can push additional money through the system, but and they have indicated they can do this quite quickly. So it's a very excellent way of expanding reach to the population in times of needs, but also in their regular life cycle approach. And then with regards to early action or anticipatory action and social protection, the linkages there. Australia has supported UNOCHA the last couple of years and to develop anticipatory action frameworks in the Indo-Pacific region. For example, the new early action mechanisms for tropical cyclones in Fiji. So this includes pre-agreed financing to support cash transfers through the existing Fiji government social protection systems when triggers are reached. And so that's a really interesting example of, and we have seen more of that in the region, but to look at using existing systems, but external financing that can complement the routine social protection payments. And in the meantime, the government of Fiji is also strengthening its own social protection systems operations with the support from the Partnerships for Social Protection, so that these programs can also be more effectively leveraged for shock response. Just very briefly, and so I have talked mostly about national systems, but of course, and the complementary of also community-based approaches. Australia has established an anticipatory action fund through its Australian Humanitarian Partnership to trial community-based anticipatory action. So small injections of cash will support communities to take preemptive actions prior to hazards and to complement national initiatives. And so the purpose here is for communities to use their ancestral knowledge and practices to support their families' incomes and livelihoods, and against those predictable calamities or shocks. So these are only small, medium-scale early action approaches, but they can support learning across the region, and hopefully they also provide an opportunity to inform some national policy as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Any reaction? Johnny, you want to add on that?
Yes, I wanted to add some point for Ian explanation based on my experience. Of course, the humanitarian responses planned, funded, carried out, especially in relation to the social protection mechanism, but the humanitarian needs increasing because of the climate related events and shocks. So the social protection mechanism has to expand the scoping of the delivering humanitarian needs to affected populations. So, however, the funding from the donor is shrinking. Besides, the majority of the humanitarian actors, including the governments, take action after the crisis hits. It means the more money and efforts, aid are needed. It making difficulties social protection to the to contribution to the humanitarian efforts. I guess also, I think that if the cash and voucher program in social protection sits in the anticipatory action phase of the disaster management cycle in your country, it can provide opportunities for us to manage risks and reduce the strain on the humanitarian resources, as well as to lead the sustainable responses to the climate impact, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you. And maybe I will go back more to Matthew and Sayanti to build on your presentation, but also what the panel just say about where can CVA be designed to support and link to the longer term holistic approach? What need to be in place? There are some reaction about country system, etc. In the Q&A box linked to that. Do you have other examples that you present on how to try to do that, and maybe elaborate also a bit more on the cash for work public work intervention? Maybe Matthew and then Sayanti on that.
Sure, thanks. I mean, I think we've covered a lot of territory here, which is great. The in terms of the range of partners involved, I mean, I kind of touched on this towards the end of my presentation about how encouraging I think it is to see, for example, under the UNFCCC processes, that you've got such a different range of partners. So you've got, some of the big UN agencies involved in terms of, not just FAO, but WFP and others, UNDP, in these kinds of programming contexts. But you also have NGOs, international organizations. I like in this Mozambique Save the Children program, the emphasis on involving local government into these programs, and this kind of interface between local, national government, NGOs and other actors, in terms of building these linkages between the shock responsive side of things and the longer term adaptation. And I think I just find that really encouraging. I looking at the responses in the chat and the kind of questions coming forward, I think people are engaged in this space, but it's a real challenge to get the right people around the table. And where you're talking about kind of humanitarian actors, they'll be in certain settings, for example, with ministries of disaster risk reduction who have responsibility there, but that may or may not be the same ministry as responsible for overall social protection. And then certainly, for example, ministries of agriculture, Ministry of Environment. We recently ran with UNICEF a workshop in the Caribbean region, bringing together people from 14 different countries from the Ministries of Social Development. And here, to me, there's a real capacity building process that needs to go on with all of these partners to get people around the table. As we, one thing we haven't talked about is in terms of the kind of overall climate strategies at the moment that we're in the process of. Every country globally is in the process of determining their new nationally determined contributions that will be released next year. Now that process is usually led by the Ministry of Environment. It's not predetermined who will be part of that conversation. So I think that is another opportunity for, again, as I said, this kind of wide range of actors to get involved and to get engaged in the NDCs that then form the basis for climate strategies going forward. And we've been encouraging actors within the social protection community to engage as much as possible in this process, but I would also encourage actors within the CVA and humanitarian sector to find out what's going on nationally and to engage with that process, because it's the basis for this longer term strategic planning that we're talking about. In terms of the public works, and there will be some work, perhaps Jana could post a link to our group in the chat. So Jana, Sayanti and myself are the co-chairs of the Universal Social Protection 2030 Working Group on Social Protection and Climate Change. Sorry, it's a mouthful. Where anybody in this group who's really interested in these issues, do engage, do join in that group. This is the kind of this is the bread and butter of what we talk about and engage. And at the moment, we're in the process of developing some guidance for countries about how to engage in NDCs. But that would be, the kind of perhaps the primary audience is the government. But we're interested in certainly, making this relevant for all partners. On public works, I'll hand over to Sayanti after this. But on public works, I think it's a really interesting approach. I think in relation to the kind of climate challenges that we see and the issue, in the short, medium, and long term, I think public works in one form or another is going to play an absolutely critical role, not just in shock response, but in longer term adaptation at the community and the household level. And we need much more ambitious approaches to what public works can do and achieve. So again, that Mozambique program is very promising, but the Botswana program that I mentioned as well, where we're talking about not just low-skilled approaches in public works, but trying to kind of upskill people. Now that's maybe tricky in a crisis context, but I think if we're talking about kind of cash models here, the cash plus approaches and these more ambitious public works programs are really the direction we ought to be going in when we're looking to build systems going forward. So I'll let Shanti maybe come in now.
Thanks. I think most of it was covered, but for me, in my experience, just one point is that these regional technical working groups that have been established, exist in Asia Pacific, have been doing quite a bit of work around this, bringing together like FAO, WFP, UNICEF. They're all members of these. These are humanitarian agencies. These are members of this platform, right? And they have brought together many of these Save the Children, regional stakeholders based on different countries who's involved and who's working in these spaces. These regional platforms have been bringing together some of these actors who are doing social protection in support either to the national governments or running their own programs, for instance. And recently, I've seen that many of these platforms, at least the Asia Pacific one, as well as the Sahel, Northern Africa, and MENA one, they have been quite a bit focused on how to do on the social protection topic in general, and then also understanding how to leverage social protection programs, because humanitarian actors are also realizing that some limits are being reached and they cannot be at all places at all the time. So where is it possible to collaborate and lean on some existing systems is what has come into the thinking already. And so I've seen in the recent work we have been developing for the Asia Pacific region, particularly the Asia Pacific Technical Working Group has been developing a whole anticipatory action module, for instance, like introductory chapters and introduction on anticipatory action and so on. And they wanted to have a module also on anticipatory action and social protection, even though it was an optional module, but it was something that was requested that we then delivered on. And then it was also done in Philippines, Indonesia, where a training of trainers to run with the module and do these modules at the national level, just so that all the counterparts, all the agencies involved can actually link up these two beasts in a way, and see where are the linkages. So there, also Philippines, Indonesia, some of these countries have been working and building strong social protection systems in the region. So they have a starting point for doing this anticipatory action through social protection. So I just wanted to say that these working groups and platforms have been doing and bringing in together some of this thinking that's happening in the social protection. And so the webinars like this are also helping. So it's hopefully not all grim. Over to you, Celine.
Thank you so much, Auntie. Yes, thank you for all this great point and pushing us to do better and link better together with what is already existing. It gives us also a lot of hope. I'm sorry, we are almost out of time, so I have still a lot of questions, and I definitely can spend much more time with such an amazing panel. But maybe to try to wrap up, will you be able to give us, as a global audience, what might be the opportunity, what was the enabler that are needed to support and accelerate all that transformation to effectively assist the population, of course, with what's going on now, but also in the future of climate change. I'm sorry, it's a super big question. I will give you only 1 minute or even less each. So, Jana, do you want to have a try first?
Sure, I can try. As you said, it's a really big question. But I think to me, what I see both as an opportunity and an enabler really in this whole question is this issue about, focusing on the system, right? And I think climate change is really giving us this opportunity because it's something that will affect all aspects of life, and it's affecting all people. And I think we're more and more realizing that it is not just something that only affects poor people or that only affects certain groups, but it is such a holistic issue that will require a holistic response. And I have the hope that it's pushing us to a place that we should have been at already a long time ago, right? Which is recognizing that we have to, really put more effort into building these, universal rights-based social protection systems rather than, sticking to the little piecemeal approaches and little projects and little, emergency responses here and there, and that it's bringing us all together to think about how we can work on an integrated solution for how to get there, because of course it also doesn't happen overnight.
Thank you. Anyone else who want to build on that? So focus on system, any other enabler opportunities that you want to share? Inge, do you want to give a try?
Yeah, sure. I completely agree with what Yara said, and I had 2 points, and that was one of them. But so the other one was more about, I guess, enabling a national level platform. So we talk at a regional level, we talk at a global level, but I think there's a need to create more national level platforms and partnerships that bring together government and civil society and international actors for that knowledge exchange on national and community level kind of climate change efforts and social protection efforts, and to really support that inclusive policy making. I guess also to make social protection and humanitarian support more inclusive. And I think that was one of Matthew's big points as well. And so to make sure that the needs of those most marginalized are met as well, and that they are reached. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you. And Matthew, I think I'll give you the floor directly. If you want to add on.
You've covered both of my key points, because I was gonna emphasize, for me, the two aspects, really are this long-term strategy. Climate change, yes, it's systematic, it's hitting everybody across the whole country, but also we're going to be dealing with this for the remainder of our lifetimes, for the remainder of our professional lives, and therefore our thinking should be, always to the medium and the long term, as well as to whatever short-term crises we're dealing with. And this is really the opportunity for us to, put that put that longer term perspective in play and think about these systems. And then the second aspect for me, was to really emphasize the importance of this inclusive agenda. So I think these different population groups have come up repeatedly. We could, people with disabilities, we're about to do some work looking explicitly about how to include people with disabilities within social protection for climate action. A group we haven't talked about very much in this is migrants. I mean, so important to think about migration in relation to climate change and social protection, both at origin and destination. Indigenous peoples, who we know are affected in all sorts of ways, but also there's real dangers sometimes when social protection and more broad climate adaptation or climate mitigation actions aren't done in ways that really involve Indigenous peoples from the very beginning as owners and leaders of that process. So all these different population groups where I think we need to keep that kind of the importance of inclusion front and center, and the role that social protection can play in making this climate action more inclusive. Those would be my 2 points.
Thank you so much. And Shayanti, the last.
Yeah, very quickly. I think most has been said, but I think sometimes we are bound by institutions and mandates, and it's difficult to incorporate all this long-term thinking, which is absolutely important. But I feel most projects that we're working on has some entry points, and there are tools that you can use to see how you can actually incorporate climate risks information and so on, climate assessments that you can do of current projects, programs, of how do we actually start thinking about these risks and the groups and build some of these components in place to do this long-term journey. So I would also suggest that let's start with what we have, what we're working on currently, and see how best to even improve wherever the next phase is, and just work with that. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. It's a lot of great advice here. Now let's try to work better together, build on what is existing, and try to move that forward. It was amazing to have all of you. I'm so sorry we got a bit out of time. For those who want to continue the discussion, tomorrow there will be social protection hangout done by sp.org with DFAT. There, Matthew will be a special guest tomorrow, so maybe he can finish his presentation and continue the discussion. I hope to see most of you, so it will be same time, different place. I will put again the Zoom link in the chat. Thank you again for all the amazing speaker and panelists. Thank you for you, the audience. And please, if you still have 1 minute from the audience, maybe suggest in the chat what will be the webinars that you will from the community of practice, which topic, which thematic you want us to have. Even if you have idea of panelists, we are taking that, knowing that next one will be the last one before the big climate COP. So if you want to have very specific discussion to prepare that better for your organization, please let us know in the chat. And Jerome, I give you the floor for ending this webinar.
Thank you, Celine. Thank you, colleagues. We know we promised to be on time. Apologies, but we hope that you found the webinar enriching and motivating. And I would say this webinar is such, it's captivating, and for me, it's motivating. I have learned a lot. And unfortunately, we have reached the end of our webinar. But before that, let me just share one reflection that as the different regions and countries, especially in the Asia Pacific, continue to face different harsh climate crises that stretch and overwhelm the capacities and resiliency of at-risk and disaster-affected people. And there are a lot of opportunities on how social protection can be used as a policy tool, policy intervention to reduce the vulnerabilities and protect lives and dignity. We hope you found this webinar, again, useful in your own organization, in working with different stakeholders, especially the government, in terms of longer-term programming. And we hope that we can continuously work together, as Celine mentioned, working together on finding the linkages and strengthening the use of social protection in humanitarian and longer-term programming with the governments, with us, and the entire humanitarian community. We look forward to more engagements and collaborations with you. Big thanks to our excellent presenters and panelists, to Shanti, to Matthew, to Inga, Yana, and Johnny for sharing your time, expertise, and insights today. It has been, a wonderful webinar. Thanks to Celine as well and to Ruth for organizing this one. Until the next quarterly webinar. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Thanks all. Thanks, Celine. Thanks, Jerome.
Thanks a
everyone.
lot, Matthew. See you tomorrow.
Yeah,
Thank
see
you, Matthew.
Thank you. I'm just staying on the line to answer some questions. Is that the only way to do it? Or because I think the Q&A will disappear, yeah, if I close the call.
Yes, the Q&A will disappear, but normally Reina just copy paste all the question. So we will do the Q&A on the website page. But if you can text a question and send me by email, the answer would be amazing.
Okay, so I'll just copy the question and yeah, okay, I'll do that. Yeah, no worries. Okay, thank you. It was very interesting. Good discussion.
It was great to have you.